Welcome, everybody. My name is Geoff Ebbs. I'm the head sports performance coach at FIT, and I'm super excited to host another awesome virtual event. This one's going to be very baseball-oriented and baseball detailed, taking you through all things off-season baseball training strategy. I mentioned we have a tremendous group of panelists, and that's kind of where I want to start, is just a round of intros so we can meet the other coaches on the group.
I'm Gabe Torres. I'm the S&C coordinator with the Washington Nationals, going into my 12th season. Just finished up my 11th and 4th as the S&C coordinator. Excited to be on.
My name's Hayden Letts. I'm over at Dynamic Sports Training in Houston, and I'm one of the facility directors. Been here for 8 years now.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jordyn Finney. I'm over at 2SB Sports Performance in the Metro Detroit area of Michigan, and I oversee our Novi facility as the head strength coach.
Awesome. And I appreciate all you fellas being on. And for all of our attendees, this is a really unique collection and collaboration of coaches, because in addition to getting to talk about kind of the fun nuts and bolts of off-season training stimulus, we're also going to get kind of a behind-the-scenes look for those who aren't directly involved at some of the collaboration that happens between a team performance coach, somebody like Gabe, and then, more of somebody in the private sector who's working at a facility or as a private contractor working with a high-level athlete, and the level of collaboration and communication that takes to do it effectively. I'm somebody who comes from the college environment, formerly at Northeastern, and before that, I worked in a Division III environment at UMass Boston with a competitive baseball program there. And I was fortunate in the sense that I got 7 to 8 months worth of being in the primary contact with those athletes. And even at that training volume and that number of contacts, there were certainly communication issues that popped up. And times where the communication wasn't as good as it could have been. And of course, that hinders the development of the athlete. For the type of athlete these guys are working with, that process obviously needs to be as buttoned up as humanly possible. So we'll get to talk some nuts and bolts of training, but also things like creating a unified language, how they communicate, and how they work together to build programming. Just a brief look at FIT. For those who aren't familiar with FIT, or it's your first time getting exposed to us, FIT is a sports technology company. We provide a programming and data management platform where we basically allow coaches to aggregate and analyze data in a single space, program effective stimulus based on that data, and in cases that they want to, even automate that programming. So use data that's in the platform to create some automated decisions and hopefully make their busy lives as efficiently as humanly possible. And so with all that, what I want to do is I want to start with Gabe and kind of touch on really just the offboarding process. You get done with the season and you're not going to be the direct point of contact for the athlete for an extended period of time. And we want to talk about things like testing and data collection, reporting, the relationships that you build with an outside facility, and then how you set the expectation with those coaches and that outside facility. So with that, Gabe, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Geoff. Yeah. So like he'd mentioned, there's an offboard process similar to what the inboard process might look like. And really what we try to do is we try to give the player a summary of kind of how their year went with the metrics that we collect, where we think they need to get to and why, and then provide them with as much information as we can for both their sake, but also whatever facility they might be going to. So within, you'll see a sample report here in a minute, but within it, you'll see some benchmarks that we might, we show them the benchmarks we want to get them to, where they're currently at, how it might affect how they're moving on the field. We try to connect the dots for them a little bit so that they have a good idea of what they need to work on going into the off season, but also the trainer, the strength coach who's going to be working with them on a daily basis, they also have an understanding of what we're trying to get out of them as well. So yeah. So then this is just a sample report that we give guys at the end of the year. This is one of the pages. Like I said, it just tries to connect the dots of where they were at all year, where we want them to get to, and then kind of some notes from the strength coach. Usually the strength coach at each affiliate will run through them, give them a quick rundown of where they're at, where we want them to be, and any kind of like tidbits they might have had during the season that they were working on to remind them as well. And so that we give them, they come home with this, or they go home with this, and they'll see their trend lines over here, kind of over the year, the 4 or 5 main metrics that we look at. These are from force plates, and how we track it throughout the year. And then some other how they stack up against their group. So this is just showing where they're at compared to their group. For pitchers, it'd be obviously compared to pitchers, and then position players, we compare them to their group as well. This is just a nice visual of them. Kind of the big bump in the chart is where the majority of the group is at, and where they stack up against that. So it's an easy visual for them to see, oh, my body weight, I'm only at 200, and guys in my group, they're averaging around, 210, 215 or something. So it just gives them a nice representation. We can tell them all they want that we need you to get X amount better at this. But it's nice for them to see where they stack up against their group as well. And then so then that takes you kind of into the off season for us. This is kind of a basic layout. This would be one of our affiliates. The way we set it up on Fit is each strength coach manages their affiliate in the off season. So they'll have their list of guys. We assign it to them individually, so that way any adjustments we want to make for them, it's easier on our end. I know there's a couple different ways you can do it on Fit. This is the way that we found it works best for us. And then that way there's no issue with an accidental correction on somebody's program, and it gets populated into the mass group. So this is just a sample kind of calendar for us in the off season. We can't really force them to do anything in the off season. This is just kind of a guide for them. Hopefully it's a guide also for the private facility, but we rely on the private facility to kind of get the same goals that we're trying to get to as well, right? So those benchmarks or those target numbers are just as important for in our opinion, for the private facility guy too. So he has an idea of where we want them to get them to be. So, as we all know, there's a bunch of ways to do it. This is the way that we kind of see, and if they were with us all year round, this is how we would go about it. But at the end of the day, all we care about is they got better in the off season. And then here's just a sample kind of weekly breakdown of one of those programs within the giant macro view of the off season. So yeah, I don't know.
Gabe, I want to backtrack a little bit. I'm actually going to back us up just a touch. And I think one of the challenges for coaches, if we look at these 2 slides, this is kind of a more, subjective note segment and a short list of KPIs, and then more kind of trend lines here. I think for those of us, and I'm sure it's a lot of people on the call that have a lot of data streams available to them, one of the challenges is just narrowing down the KPIs that are important. And it's really tough because I think we can, think that, hey, a dozen things are important, but A, that's tough to manage. And B, I can imagine that's really tough to communicate to another coach who hasn't been working with that athlete full time. Can you talk about that process a little bit? How challenging is it to narrow things down to KPIs that are truly important to you? And how do you go about that?
Yeah. So, I think one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, does it matter? As strength coaches, I think, at least for me personally, I don't want to speak for everybody. For me personally, it's there's certain things that I enjoy in a weight room. I enjoy being in the weight room. I enjoy lifting. I enjoy doing all these things, but does that actually matter to this athlete, to his on-field performance? Because that's all we ultimately care about is, are they getting better at the things that they need to get better at to be the best player and provide the most value they can for the org. And so we're constantly kind of checking ourselves and testing it against what is actually going on the field. So, we've been collecting force plate data now for, 4 years maybe now. And every year we do a data review. We make sure that what we're seeing is actually lining up with what we think it'll help on the field with. And we're just constantly these are the 4 metrics we use this year. They've remained relatively consistent. We've flipped out a couple because we felt like it grabbed a better, it described the athletes a little bit better. But we're constantly just double checking, hey, is this what we actually care about? Does this actually matter? And so that's how we kind of filter it. We just always want to bring it back to performance on the field.
Kind of with that too, and this is a little bit of a selfish question for my own interest, but I think one of the things that I get challenged with sometimes is that you're trying to create these kind of standards or expectations amongst the group of hey, these are the important KPIs for this, for this team or this position group or this task. But then inevitably that's going to vary a little bit depending upon the individual, right? Because we all accomplish the same tasks using a different strategy. Is that something you consider? And how do you navigate that, when showing some of these norms where it's this is where you are within the position group?
I think we just try to keep the expectations realistic. And so if, for example, we strongly believe that somebody's CI needs to get better, we can show him a nice clean graph that shows as CI goes up, this other metric might go up that we find valuable, right? And that's fine and well, but we also are very honest with them and say, hey, look, you might be at 265, 286 is your target. That's like all we kind of need from you. We don't need you to be a 320 guy. We need you to be a 290 guy. We think that just getting to that point will hopefully help you on the field. And again, I think for us, we just try to be as honest as possible. It's like, this is what we think will help, and we're just going to continue to monitor. And if we feel like it's not going to help, then we're gonna scrap it. We have no problem admitting that, hey, this isn't what we thought it was going to be, and let's scrap it. Let's look elsewhere.
Well, you just kind of inherently touched on one of my favorite things, where it's like anytime we want to talk about driving output, whether it's force plate, any objective KPI, it's not just understanding what goes into driving that KPI, but also the trade-offs. Like, what are the secondary and tertiary consequences of driving improvement in that KPI? And like, if you understand that and then how it applies to each individual, I feel like now you really have your athletes on a string a little bit. My last thing before we transition to kind of onboarding into the off season would be kind of adherence and expectation. Like, you had just kind of made the point that, like, at the end of the day, we just want our athletes getting better in the off season. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of ego that comes with that. I know I've done this before, where it's like, I feel like nobody knows, my athletes better than me, and this is kind of how I want it done. And I can imagine there's a part of you that kind of has to let go of the rope a little bit, where it's like, when you get into the off season, you got to let it go and let other people handle it. How do you strike the right balance between adherence to what you'd like done and kind of setting an expectation with other trainers and coaches they might be working with in the off season?
I mean, like I said, I don't think that our way is the only way to do anything, and I'm totally fine admitting that. We believe in certain KPIs, obviously, and certain things that we think are valuable for these athletes. And at the end of the day, if I can just communicate that to the private facility guy or the player, you just have to. I mean, there's nothing we can do at that point, right? We just trust that Hayden or Jordyn can take them through a program, and then they come back better than where they were, or at least closer to the target than where they were. Because a lot of these, at the end of the day, a lot of these pro guys, they do have a lot of faith in their private guys, and it would be foolish of me to sit here and say, like, that's not a valuable thing. Like, no, we need to lean into that. We need to lean into their trust with these guys, because the same way they do it here with us is they communicate really well with us. If we're honest with them, if we're open with them, they're going to do the same with their private guy. And I want that. And I want to be able to have that communication available. So for me, it's honestly just like, yeah, go do your thing. I just want you to get better. And these are the things that we think you need to get better at. And then if we can communicate that to the athlete and to the private facility person, then cool.
I love it. That's great stuff. And I would just comment too. I know that when I was younger, I think I used to significantly undervalue like the emotional response, right? Like, you just talked about how close an athlete might be with, it could be a coach they've been working with since they were a kid, or somebody they've relied on in the off season for years. And, regardless of the physical component that's being done, it's like the emotional response to that too, that creates a lot of positivity and a great environment for a lot of these athletes. Really, really awesome job. And so with all that, so I want to transition now kind of into the onboarding process, the off season, with a private coach or at a private facility. And so, Hayden, I'll hand it off to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, so just quick reintroduction of myself, Hayden Letts. I'm over at Dynamic Sports Training. Little rundown of our company. Been around for 17 years. We've got facilities, 3 in Houston, 1 in San Antonio, 2 in Phoenix, and then we actually have a soft opening coming up of a new one in New Braunfels, which is kind of northeast of San Antonio. But we train, youth athletes all the way up to professionals, everything in between. The photos you see here are actually of the facility I run. So a lot of times what we do is we partner with outside facilities, whether it be, high schools, colleges. We have a couple facilities that operate out of baseball complexes, and, our location at those baseball complexes, plus kind of our initial professional athletes that we worked with, have kind of made us known for baseball training. But so talking about, athlete onboarding for the off season, for us, our internal process always starts with an assessment. And that's kind of all encompassing. So we're going through body composition. For us, that is either going to be, skin fold calipers or bioelectrical impedance. We have a machine that rotates around the facilities, so it's just depending on availability. We're also going to do some extremity measurements, so upper arm, forearm, thigh cap. After that, we'll move into more of our biomechanical assessment. So we're going through standing posture, looking at everything head to toe, scap position, pelvis, ankles, all of that. And then we get into kind of the meat and potatoes, which is going to be our movement screenings. So we're going through FMS style tests, overhead squat, modified Thomas test, before moving into more isolated joint testing. So we're assessing shoulder rotation, range of motion, hip rotation, hip flexion, extension, everything you can kind of think of. We're hitting every single joint, every single plane of motion, giving us a really big picture of, the athlete's bony structure, how they move. That's going to give us insight into, their movement, obviously strategies or biases, and that's going to help us, pick which exercise variations are right for them in the weight room. And then given the athlete's availability, we'll aim to do some initial KPI testing. So for us, that's going to start out with a counter movement jump on the force plate, before going into grip strength, and then some shoulder strength testing with the handheld dynamometer. For that, we're doing seated side external rotation, supine, abducted, or 90-90 external and internal rotation, and then seated single arm scaption. And so we have a physical therapist on site who takes that data, compares it to some normative data that they've gotten through research, and kind of does, a health and risk assessment of, a lot of it's relative to body weight, or it's relative to non-dominant arm. Where do they stand in terms of rotator cuff strength? And that also gives us some insight into, what their needs are in terms of health. After the assessment, then I'll make contact. We'll kind of do kind of a post-assessment discussion with each athlete. And part of that is getting a phone number for their strength coach from the season. For me, it's going to be whoever spent the most time with them. So like if a guy spent 3/4 of the year in AA and got like a last month call up to AAA, I'm probably going to end up reaching out to that AA strength coach, because he's going to have the best insight into that athlete's year. And so, like I said, when I reach out to that strength coach, the things I'm kind of looking to get, obviously, they might not be at liberty to share all of this stuff in terms of the data, but I'm still going to ask for, in-season KPI data. Ideally, we're getting something as close as possible to the current date. So, the last month or two of the season. We can also look at, if they have data from the previous spring training or maybe month 1 of the season. That kind of gives me an idea of how that athlete progressed throughout the year. And that gives me a little insight into their training habits, how important that is to them. I'm going to ask the strength coach for the off-season goals for the athlete. So kind of like Gabe mentioned, they have certain KPIs, that are important to them. They have target values that they want each athlete to hit. So I'd like to know those. And then less performance-based and more individual-based, I'm asking about spring training expectations. So part of that is, do you have a conditioning test that the athlete's going to have to go through, which it seems like a lot of orgs are going away from, but, some are doing repeated sprint tests, basically anything kind of individual that they have to be ready for outside of normal training capabilities and baseball expectations. And then I'm asking about athlete insight. So this is going to be more personal stuff. What's their personality? What's their work ethic? Do they have exercise preferences? Are they a front squat versus a back squat guy? Did they respond really well to certain exercises? And that's especially important for me with a new athlete that I haven't worked with before. If it's we have a lot of returning pro guys that have worked with us throughout the minor leagues into the big leagues. So for a returning athlete, I'm going to be asking the strength coach, hey, I've got XYZ impression of this guy. did that line up with what you saw throughout the year, or did anything change? You know, did maybe he have some time on the IL in the beginning of the year, and that kind of, you know, had him in a little more of a negative headspace for the rest of the year? You know, or vice versa. Like, did, you know, something good happen to him? And he had kind of a more positive outlook that maybe I'm not seeing during the off season. Maybe it's, you know, when he's around all his teammates, he's a different guy altogether. And, you know, if those are positive qualities, then I'm going to try to bring that out of the athlete during the off season. And then so once I have my own picture of the athlete, once I have the organization's picture of the athlete, that's where I'll start to develop my periodization. And for me, that always starts with looking at the off-season length. That's going to tell me how much time I have with the athlete. That's going to tell me what I need to prioritize. You know, so, and we'll see this in a later slide, but, you know, I've got a minor league guy, I could have anywhere from like up to 5 to 6 months with them. If it's a big league guy, you know, let's say they're playing in the World Series, I might have 2 months, you know, because a lot of these guys, you know, they're coming off a long season. They haven't done much besides play baseball. They're going to take a couple weeks off, you know, to let their body recover. They're going to go on vacation. They're going to go home and visit family. So that's stuff I'm always mindful of. I'm looking at health and training status. You know, so obviously, are they healthy? Did they have any injuries during the year? That's going to tell me if there's certain areas I need to pay extra attention to. And then part of health status for me is looking at their workload during the season. You know, if it's a position player, did they hit like a career high in games played? If it's a pitcher, did they have a career high in innings pitched? That all that stuff goes into my assessment of their training plan. And then obviously looking at their assessment results, their initial KPI testing, and then something I pay attention to is phrased as their status with the organization. And really you call that, what is their professional experience? You know, so if they're a new draft pick or kind of a low level minor league guy, the expectation is almost always going to be just come into spring training healthy, come in ready to go through baseball activities. And you can almost look at it as a little bit of a bell curve, where the peak of that curve is those high level minor league guys are kind of up and down big league AAA guys, where maybe they're going into their first big league camp, you know, and they're trying to win a roster spot. Like, they're coming in expected to compete, expected to produce. So in terms of me programming for them, like, they're almost kind of peaking a little bit going into spring training. And then when we continue down that curve, you know, you've got your MLB veterans. You've got the guys that are established big league players. You know, they're locked into their roster spot, whatever it is. They're locked in as starting shortstop or in the rotation. And they're kind of going to have a similar outline as the low-level minor league guys, where they just need to come in healthy. They need to come in ready for baseball activity. And then obviously still be able to perform them. So looking at a full off season, again, one thing I like about FIT is I can have this broad view of kind of the full off season, what I can outline for an athlete. So this is kind of the base periodization I'll use for a minor league athlete. You know, so they're coming back second week of September. In this case, this was probably a low A guy. You know, the season ends pretty early, and I've got close to 6 months with them. You know, so I'm going to line out what I want them to go through. I can take my time going through, you know, kind of a full restoration block, some more just higher volume concentric emphasis, which I phrase as accumulation. You know, we're just accumulating load and volume. Get into some tempo work before getting into more of our heavier, you know, higher percentage concentric work, some speed work, and then finishing off on some, you know, SPP stuff right before they leave. And then just looking at these programs down here, you know, this is kind of how we lay out our pro off season. So we run a structured group where the group starts at 10. You know, these guys are getting here at about 9:30. They're going through their corrective exercises, which we're basing off the assessment. We've got our speed and movement work first, you know, so that's going to be a lot of our plyo and med ball work. Guys will break off, they'll do the throwing. They'll go through their, what we call enforcer work or post throw, and then get into their strength work. And so, I mean, I'm a very organized person. I love being able to lay all this out, have it very detailed of, hey, we're going to hit this for an hour, this for an hour, you know, throw for 45 minutes ish, hit your post throw, do your strength work. It keeps expectations clear, and just keeps guys on task. And then, so this is kind of an example of what my tempo block, you know, so we're doing some accentuated eccentric work, got a little bit of isometric emphasis in there. And for me, my strength work is going to be a lot of compound lifts. We're hitting a lot of plyos and med ball work during the speed stuff. During, you know, our post throw stuff, we're doing a lot of cuff, scap, forearm, bicep, tricep work. So that gives me time during the strength program to hit a lot of compound lifts, get a little more volume in there, and then I can still add, you know, some extra vitamins or accessories at the end on a more individual basis. You know, and that goes back to that strength test that we do during the assessment where, hey, this guy, you know, is lacking a ton of external rotation strength. So on top of that post throw stuff, you know, at the end of his upper body days, I'm probably throwing in a little extra cuff work in there. And then looking at, you know, just a case study here on an MLB guy, you know, so we have KPIs that we'll track. We're looking at peak propulsive power often, you know, and we're viewing that as just total output of the body. Like power isn't necessarily plane specific. That's going to come down to skill development a lot of the time. But as a unit, we want to be powerful. And then obviously looking at that as a relative metric as well, just keeping body weight in the back of our mind. You know, because let's say 6,000 watts coming out of a 180-pound guy versus a 240-pound guy looks like two different movements altogether. So this particular athlete, you know, saw a pretty good improvement in propulsive power. And as a result, you know, had a close to a 1.5 mile an hour jump in fastball velocity. Specifically, that climbed from 76th percentile up to the 88th percentile in MLB. Obviously, saw velo increases across all of his other pitches. And then one thing that's handy for me is, you know, looking at the peak relative propulsive power. We use Hawken Dynamics force plates. They released some normative data from big league players a few years ago. And so that change of this athlete's from about 61 watts per kilogram up to 65 shifted him from that good tier for percentile up to elite among MLB jump data. So that was pretty cool to see that, you know, that shift resulted in a good on-field performance improvement for him. And then this was also the first time in his career that he hit 100 miles an hour. So just some good benchmarks there for him. And as a result, you know, guys leave for the off season. They always say, you know, I feel really good. I'm ready to go. But seeing results like this, you know, he's coming back and he's pumped, like he's ready to come back in and just, you know, see what he can accomplish this following year. Like if he did this last year, like if he makes improvements in, you know, X, Y, or Z, like where can he be coming into next year? But that's, you know, how we go about our off season.
Awesome. Jordyn, go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, what's up, guys? Just again, my name's Jordyn. I work for 2SB Sports Performance out in Michigan, and I'm in a pretty unique position within our company because I actually am embedded within a baseball-specific training facility. So I get to see these guys throw and hit on a day-to-day basis and build out our off-season accordingly to, you know, different velo phases or wherever they're at hitting-wise and whatnot. But here are just some pictures of our facility. It's relatively new. This will be our second off season in this space. Yeah. So similarly to Hayden's kind of assessment or onboarding, we do a similar table assessment where we look at a lot of, you know, table range of motion, shoulder ER, IR, shoulder flexion, all the hip stuff, hip ER, IR flexion. We'll do quad tests. We'll look at infrasternal angle as well to just see, you know, is this more of a springy guy? Is he going to be a guy who produces more power? And that's going to change our exercise selection quite significantly. And then just previous workout history. What have they done? What are they used to? What do they enjoy? What do they not enjoy? I'm a big believer that these guys know their bodies probably a lot better than I do. So usually what works well for them in the past will probably work well here now, under some guidance and some structure. So being in constant communication with, how are they feeling? What do they enjoy? What do they not enjoy is a big premium. And we'll shift and do more of a dynamic movement screening, where we do a lot of kind of a similar test that Hayden was talking about. So a lot of the main positions that we're going to see these guys be in. So a lot of thoracic extension, a lot of hip hinging, spinal flexion, scap retraction and protraction, just making sure that they know how to move these joints really, really well. And then we're able to load it. One thing I forgot to mention too, though, in our table assessment is we like to look at really like troubled areas that get a lot of buildup through the season. So, lats, get a ton of tone, pecs create a lot of tone, hip flexors cause some issues. So assessing those and doing some manual decompression stuff on them. Because a lot of times, like for an example, we have guys who have significant internal rotation of their shoulder deficit. And we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper and be like, okay, your lat is super, super toned up. And then when we can do kind of like a test and retest type of thing, so we can decompress their lat a little bit, be like, wow, we just gained an extra 20, 30 degrees of range of motion. So that's going to play a big part into how we program these guys where, maybe we're not doing a ton of pull-ups or overhead pulling variations. And we're focused on more of the, low trap, serratus, kind of these more posterior muscles that are going to kind of sync their arm up a little bit better. So that's a big part. And then we move into more of a performance assessment. So we also have Hawk force plates. So we will do, your normal CMJ jump, a squat jump, and then a multi-rebound. And then we do 10 and 20 yard sprint times as well. We are relatively new when it comes to doing a lot of pro guys. So we actually get a lot of indie ball guys. And, they're usually here for, I've had guys here for almost 7-8 months throughout the off season. So I don't get a ton of data, or I don't get a ton of input from their coaches or, whoever they're working with in season. So a lot of it comes from them. A lot of it comes from what does their coach say about where they need to improve in this next off season. And I'm very fortunate that I actually get to see them hit and throw in facility too, with very, very professional and good hitting and throwing coaches. We have TrackMan data, Adjutonic stuff, so we can actually see what do they really need in constant communication with on the performance side. So this is we're using a eccentric utilization ratio, which basically is how well do they use their stretch shortening cycle. This is something we've been looking at quite a bit, and not just in terms of performance, but just overall health. So actually compare their squat jump height and their counter movement height. And see like, okay, is this someone who needs a lot more eccentric work? Do they need to, be able to stretch and relax their muscles in a more efficient way to allow safety, allow better performance? And this is kind of where we've been diving into a little bit more with our metrics. And usually in the past we've structured it very much so like, your strength hypertrophy blocks, your eccentric isometrics, and keep working on to more speed stuff. But we're kind of getting to a point where it's like, okay, I have an athlete here who came back in at a higher breaking RFD, who came back in at a higher breaking net impulse, which are pretty good strength metrics. Like, why do I need to kind of force that issue with him now? So kind of almost meeting our athlete where they're at. And that's not to say we neglect strength stuff or eccentric or iso work, but what's the main priority? What does this guy need to get him, out of the American Association into pro ball or into Mexico or into overseas? Or how do we get this guy to another level outside of just kind of doing things how everybody else may do it? And this again is kind of our periodization as well. Again, this guy that I'm showing you is in dire need of using his stretch sorting cycle. So he has no eccentric capability really. And we're kind of walking him through that. And this is kind of a example here on the next page of just what that looks like. And it just looks like your typical kind of eccentric block. But then we retest and retest again. So we'll have our guys do their squat jumps, their CMJ jumps weekly, and then we can kind of assess over, 4 or 5 week period and see down our decision tree where do they need to go next and whatnot. So yeah.
Unbelievable stuff. I have some stuff I wrote down. I'm going to kind of work backwards and then I'm going to open up some questions too from the group. If you're on the call, make sure you get some questions in for these guys. And so Jordyn, for you, one of the things you touched on looking at your force plate data is something I touched on in our last virtual event, actually, that I've called the limit or bridge philosophy, right? Where it's like, if somebody's excellent in certain qualities and maybe we're, not so excellent in others, it's like, well, we're not just going to train things for the sake of training it. Let's kind of meet them where they're at and start to bias the program that direction. So absolutely love that philosophy. I'm curious, in terms of the EUR that you had showed, do you utilize that data point more as like an assessment tool where it kind of tells you how somebody is biased and that will help you pick the drills? Or are you trying to push that EUR in a certain direction?
So we kind of funnel this through a decision tree. So we kind of have 3 different blocks that we want them. Ideally, we want them to be somewhere in the middle between, they're utilizing their stretch sorting cycle really, really well, but they're also having a lot of power and concentric ability behind it too. So through this ratio we have, if you're under 20% utilization of your stretch sorting cycle, we're going to kind of force the issue on getting you more stretch sorting kind of work. If we find yourself in that 20 to 30% range, we're going to do a balance between kind of rapid decels, eccentric work, stuff like that, and just raw power type of concentric work. And then if we find ourselves on the other side where they're just overly reliant on it, and there's just not a lot of kind of juice behind their jumps, we'll push the issue on more concentric heavy works and stuff like that to develop more peak propulsive power and different propulsive metrics.
It's awesome. Yeah, such a cool utilization of that KPI and force plate data, and obviously the fit system too. I know you can create those decision trees there. Hayden, for you, one thing that I had written down was do you ever have a situation where you might have a KPI that's been established by the organization that you guys are kind of in agreement that's important, but for whatever reason you just can't get that KPI to move in a certain direction? Like, has that ever happened where maybe it's just not going the way that you want? And how do you handle that situation, both with the athlete but also with the organization?
For sure. I think the athlete is the easy one to handle. They're not necessarily, they don't necessarily care about the metrics, right? Like, they care if they're better at their sport. And that's ultimately our goal, is like, I want you to be better at your sport. And I think at the end of the day, the organization recognizes that as well. Like, athletes are coming to us to train, like, to throw harder, to run faster, hit the ball harder. Now, when it comes to actually looking at that metric, and we both understand the significance of it, I think it also depends on what the rest of the picture looks like. If it's peak power is going down, I'm looking at that and I'm trying to find out what else might be causing that outside of just, a lack of, or like a decrease in performance. Like, is there some external factor at home? Like, is it, they get sick and lose a bunch of body weight? And then I think you can look at, is it an acute issue? Is it a chronic issue? Like, throughout the whole off season, is that value just constantly dropping? At that point, it might be a conversation we have to have. I've had to do that before. I have a conversation with the athlete, because when you notice the pattern, you pick up on stuff that you remember. It's little habits of maybe they're skipping lifts, maybe they're not really pushing themselves as they should, or is it kind of a one-off?
I think, to speak to Hayden's point as well, like, all this data that we have and the tech that we have is kind of a means to an end. Like, we're not solely reliant on getting them to specific numbers because every high level MLB guy is at this metric. It's, at the end of the day, how do we better our athletes so that they perform better on the field? Because that's ultimately why they're here with us. We've had MLB vets who jump 16 on our force plates, who have metrics who are not super like flashy. And on the other side, we have guys who jump super, super well and have all these crazy metrics, but they just don't play well on the field. So it's all a tool. to get us to help our guys be better in, you know, what they're ultimately getting paid to do.
Yeah. And that's another thing is like, I mean, baseball is a very interesting sport. Like body types don't always align with athleticism. You know, you've got the big bodied pitchers that throw 100 and have 15-year careers. And then you've got the lean, mean, strong position players who, you know, fizzle out in a year. Like it's a very skill dependent sport. And the weight room doesn't always transfer over to that. Like we've had guys that, you know, not even from like a lack of trying, like have had kind of that decrease in, you know, force plate numbers throughout an off season, and they go out and have, you know, their best year ever. Like there's a lot that goes into it. Yeah.
It's funny, right? Right. Like you had said, like, oh, it doesn't always apply. And I think, you know, I think if sometimes as a strength coach or a trainer, if you're trying to hit the bullseye, some athletes just make it a lot harder to hit the bullseye, right? Like maybe they're not as highly adaptable, or they have some variables about them that make it a little harder to figure out how we kind of augment their off-season training. But that brings me back to rule number one. It's like, regardless of who you're working with, don't screw it up, right? Like these guys have a lot of gifts. There's an infinite number of reasons and possibilities how they got to where they got to. Make sure you don't mess it up. And I know it sounds overly simple, but you know, for me, it's like the golden rule. Gabe, we got a question in the chat for you here. It is, how do you guide athletes that you cannot see or force compliance from in the off season? And I think for you, that question would also kind of be like, do you have any athletes who don't have guys like these guys in the off season, like Hayden and Jordyn? And how do you handle those cases?
Yeah, so I guess for the first part of that question is, again, it comes back to just being as open with our athletes as of what we expect and why, and being like, an athlete can come into my office at any point, at any day, and we can go over every single bit of data that we collect and why we think it's important, and we don't hide anything from anybody. And then also just building that relationship with the facility that they're going to explain to them, again, this is what we want them to achieve. Do what you want, but we're just trying to get him to this point. And I mean, I think we're all in agreement that like bigger, faster, stronger is kind of like, it sounds simple, but if all of our guys were just a little bit more athletic to varying degrees, that's probably better for them. And then for the second part of the question, we deal with a lot of like Latin players who don't necessarily have the resources that some of the stateside guys have. And don't ever get force plates until they're back in the org. But at the end of the day, I think jumping is jumping, sprinting is sprinting, moving fast is moving fast, getting better at your movement patterns is getting. And so if we can just continue to harp that point with them while they're here with us, and then when they go home, we check in as much as we can with them, and we just keep reiterating, like, are you sprinting? Are you jumping? Are you doing these things? And you just don't know. We have guys who come back and they're like, did you do anything? And we have guys that come back and like, whoa, you really killed it, and you can see it. And yeah, I think you just have to give up control. I mean, I'd like to sit here and say that we've got it all figured out, but I don't know that we do, to be honest. So
last question for all you guys. Anybody can chime in on this, but you know, obviously we've talked about a lot of different things surrounding testing and training stimulus and monitoring. Not everybody has access to those things, and then I think some of those discussions change based on age. Question is, how would or wouldn't you change this process if you were working with high school club or D3 level?
So I actually,
Yeah.
so high school is my main population that we run. So we run a lot of programs with them. Now, granted, we still utilize all of our force plate stuff with them. But we just kind of meet them where they're at. We have standards for our high schoolers, for our college guys, for our professional guys. And again, like kind of to Gabe's point, like if we can just make them a little more athletic, they're going to respond really well, especially at that younger age level where they adapt a lot faster. So again, it's kind of just like working with the athlete that we have in front of them. What do they really need at the end of the day to get them to make their varsity team, to get them to play Division III baseball, Division II baseball, whatever level it is. And I think following a good structure, like I think you've seen through all of our stuff here, is they usually start off pretty slow in the offseason. They start off with a big strength base. And then we kind of just keep moving the needle forward towards some more speed stuff and not trying to rush that, but just meeting them where they're at and seeing how they adapt to everything.
Yeah, I think with high school is very tough. So as a broad picture, we're always going to follow the same process for an athlete. We're going to assess them. We're going to figure out their strengths, deficiencies, train them appropriately. I think with high school and college, there's a lot of external factors that weigh in where, for us specifically as a private company dealing with high school kids, our biggest thing is them getting overworked. They're coming to us to get, structured, detailed training plans, but they're still having to go into the school weight room 3 days a week for their football coach to tell them, squat, bench, deadlift, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So we're dealing with that. If it's college kids, they're on top of all the practices and everything, they've got schoolwork, they're going to have social lives. So there's a lot more, I would say, in the college side, there's a lot more day-to-day adjustment that has to happen. And I'm speaking specifically to baseball. I had, a year in the college baseball side where there was a lot of day of adjustments they're having, hey, so-and-so isn't pitching today, or hey, this guy is pitching today, or whatever it might be. And then on the high school side, I think everything just becomes a lot more basic. You can get a really wide range of training experience in high school where you'll have, kids that come in as freshmen and they've already got 3, 4, 5 years of training, like structured training under their belt. We have kids that come in to train with us as young as 9 or 10. And then you'll get the freshmen that have never even stepped foot in the weight room. And so, you've got this base program and you could have 2 athletes walk in the door and that thing's blown up, and so that's where, as a strength coach, we have to be good. We have our regressions, our progressions where I can take 2 athletes and say, hey, this isn't appropriate for you. You're doing X, Y, and Z, follow me or follow this assistant coach over here. Or maybe it's the opposite, one kid is just miles above the rest of the team. And it's like, hey, we're going to modify your stuff. We're going to get, a better adaptation out of you than you would get out of this kind of basic program. That just goes back to what Jordyn said, you meet them where they're at. And that's just where it almost becomes fun as a strength coach because it kind of tests your skill to make on the fly adaptations.
Yeah,
We just got one more. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna add. I mean, I know we don't necessarily deal with quote unquote, middle school or high school athletes, but the ages and the variety, like Hayden mentioned, in terms of training age, we go through it. So we've got 27-year-old guys who've been around, they've got their routine, and we've got 17-year-old kid in the DR who's never stepped foot in a weight room. And it's just understanding those limitations and managing the expectations and understanding what you're looking at, I think is the main thing. So it's not necessarily that the process changes. It's just knowing that if I jump a 17-year-old kid who's never stepped foot in a weight room, if I jump him on the plates, I don't know how much like stock I can put into that day one, right? You still collect it and we still look at it and we think it's a nice little anecdote, but we have to understand what we're looking at. And I think that's just top to bottom. So.
Yeah, so good. And I think I just got flashbacks a little bit, when Hayden had started there and you would just use that simple expression, like what moves the needle. And I used to work for a coach years ago. I was on staff, and anytime we'd be talking about like the nuts and bolts of training, he would always kind of lean in and ask me like, Geoff, what's going to move the needle? But it really is so true. It's like, regardless of who you're working with, you kind of have to start with that as a simple question. You could be working with a young adolescent or, professional athletes like you guys. And the answer is going to be different, but kind of the process really shouldn't change that much once you have a good coherent process. Everybody, you guys are certainly really busy. I can't thank enough for doing this. And I know all of our coaches and practitioners that joined us, I'm sure, are busy as well. So you guys are as good as gets. I know I just got a lot smarter. I can't thank you guys enough. If you joined us today, make sure you're on the lookout for the event blog that we'll be sending out in the coming days. These guys have been good enough to let us have their contact information, so we'll make sure it's on that. And if you have specific questions for Gabe, Hayden, or Jordyn, you'll be able to reach out to them or myself as well. So thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody jumping on. Fellas, thanks very much.
Thank you.